Hello, my name is Jake Salomi, and welcome to my Masterworks presentation on motorbike mechanics. For my young Masterworks project, I chose to rebuild a dirt bike. I chose this topic for many reasons. I think the one big reason is because, as you can see, I have been jazzed about mechanics for all of my life. Whether it was working on boat motors in the summer, or my grandpa telling me stories of when he was a mechanic. So, as I got older, I thought it would be fun to do my own project, and Masterworks was the perfect opportunity to do so. I had to decide what I was going to work on, and that is when I thought of the dirt bike. My dad had a dirt bike growing up, and he always told me stories about riding. From a young age, I always dreamed of having one of my own. I always asked if we could have one, and Dad, he kept saying no. I knew dirt bike was what I would want to work on, and my parents were on board with it, as long as I sold it afterwards. Finally, my dad said yes. First, I had to find a broken bike to buy. Then, I planned to take the motor out from the bike and completely take the motor apart. Once I found out what was wrong with the engine, then I would have to fix it. The first step to my Masterworks was buying the bike. I had a budget of around $1,500, so that narrowed down the options a lot. The bike I was going to buy also had to be broken. I also wanted a bike that would have parts that were easy to find. So with those three things in mind, I got searching. I spent most of my time looking on Facebook Marketplace, because that was the website that has most of the options. I was looking for a bike for around 3 weeks before I found one that I thought might work, a 1994 Kawasaki KDX 200. My dad and I went out to look at it, but the person was asking for more money than we were willing to spend, and there was not too much wrong with it, so we decided to go home and sleep on it. After some thinking, we decided that the Kawasaki was not the right bike, and so we kept on looking. That's when I came across this 2003 Yamaha YZ125. The seller was asking a reasonable price, so we sent the guy a message, and he said we could come look at it. The bike wouldn't start, and the engine was partly seized and wouldn't even turn over. Perfect. So we bought it for $1,300, and the guy even gave us a rack for the back of the car. I was super excited to finally have my own dirt bike and start working on this project. So we put it on the back of our car and drove home. When I first got the bike, it didn't work. We had some idea about what was wrong with it, but not really. So now I wasn't really the owner of a dirt bike, but just a piece of metal, or at least that's what my dad told me. Before I go too deep into my presentation, I'm going to give a brief explanation of how an engine works. As you can see on the right, we have a diagram of what a simple carburetor. The carburetor takes a mix of air and fuel, which is mixed by a jet, and then mixed together in the perfect, what's the word? Ratio, thank you. It is then gone into the engine via the throttle valve. The throttle valve is opened or closed via how much throttle you give the bike. The more throttle you give the bike, the more open the throttle valve will be, and more fuel and air will go into the engine, making it run faster. And then, the diagram on the left, we have an engine. The engine takes air and fuel from the carburetor up this port right here, and is taken up into the top of the cylinder, where it is then compressed by the piston and then ignited by the spark plug. The spark plug then creates a mini explosion, which drives the piston back down, turning the crankshaft and moving the engine, and also create a suction for more air and fuel to be sucked into the engine. And then that burnt fuel and air is sent out of the engine in the form of exhaust. The obvious first step to my rebuild process was to take out the engine. This sounds simple enough, but it is complicated and tedious because it involves taking off a series of hoses, wires, bolts, exhaust pipe, carburetor, and the rear exhaust and the rear shock to allow the engine to be removed from the frame of the dirt bike. The first thing that I saw with the engine that was wrong was when I first took off the cylinder head. This exposed the top of the piston, which you can see on the right, and the top of it had melted debris and plastic on it. When I then proceeded to take off the cylinder, I could see that the plastic stuffers in the crankshaft had melted, and there were bits of plastic that had fallen into the engine. The stuffers are what filled the airspace in the crankcase around the connecting rod, and it was obvious that the connecting rod bearing had failed, overheated, melted the stuffers, and then finally seized tight. I now knew that I would have to do a complete engine rebuild of the dirt bike. In this video, you can see me removing some plastic debris from the crankcase. Now that I knew the problem, I started to get to work. The first thing I had to do was take apart the engine. One valuable piece of advice that my advisor Jeff gave me was to use Tupperware containers to store the different parts of the engine into, so each area of the engine would have its own container. He also recommended that I take lots of photos and notes to help during the reassembly, which definitely saved me from a knee disaster. Because there are almost 500 pieces to this project. I did the teardown in stages over several days and weeks. This involved taking apart the power valve, water pump, clutch, shifting mechanism, transmission, and crankcase, along with much more. And this photo only shows about half of what was in the engine. It was a big job at times because there's so many parts I had to keep track of. I also had to utilize some specialty tools and pullers to pull the engine apart without damaging parts that would have to be reused. I also had to very thoroughly clean all the parts with solvent or detergent and compressed air to remove all traces of old oil and debris. Luckily, I was able to find a Yamaha service manual on the internet. It has lots of drawings, specifications, and assembly procedures. It definitely helped, but it was in 4 languages and 600 pages long, and reminded me of IKEA instructions. The next step to my rebuild process was to send the cylinder to a shop called Mongoose Machine Shop to have the cylinder replated, bored to the right size, and then honed. This process will take out all nicks and scratches inside the cylinder and basically make it brand new. The plating is a very hard nickel silicone alloy, and the honing creates a cross-hatch pattern to help retain oil to lubricate the cylinder and help the piston ring set and seal into the inside of the cylinder. The machine shop asked that I send them the new piston so they could accurately bore the cylinder diameter to the new piston. The YZ125 has a high-performance race engine, and the clearance between the cylinder and piston is about the width of a human hair. Once I had the engine completely apart, I then had to replace the bearings that are in the engine and the transmission cases. These bearings are what support the transmission shafts, shifting mechanism, and the crankshaft. It is very important that these bearings are in good condition because if they're not, it could cause catastrophic engine failure. Because the main connecting rod bearing failed, it's possible that the engine's main crankshaft bearings were damaged and could fail due to lack of lubrication or debris, so it was important that I replace those bearings. I placed the engine cases in the oven. This caused the aluminum cases to heat up and expand, helping the steel bearing that expanded less to fall out. I thought I was pretty smart here using my science knowledge, thanks to Pam. When I installed the bearings, I put them in the freezer to shrink them, to make it easier to install. All of this really impressed my mother, as the smell of burnt oil lingered in our kitchen for a few days, and I'm pretty sure I could taste it in that next lasagna. I'll wait. Now that I replaced the main bearings and seals, and had all my parts, I was ready to begin putting the rest of my engine back together. The first step was to install the new crankshaft. Installing the crankshaft required careful use of a special crank puller tool to ensure that it was installed squarely and without too much pressure on the bearings, which could damage them or bend the engine cases. Next, I installed the transmission and shifting mechanism, which you can see on the left. This part freaked me out a little bit. I was intimidated because there's so many parts involved. This delayed me a few weeks in my rebuild process. The transmission consists of many gears positioned in 2 different shafts that would engage and disengage depending on what gear you were in. Once the crankshaft and transmission were in the one side of the engine case, I was ready to put the other half of the engine case to close the engine. Each nut and bolt in the engine has a specific tightening specification, so I used a torque wrench on most nuts and bolts to get the torque just right. Many bolts and nuts were locked in place with a Loctite glue or lock washers. The next step was to put the clutch plates back on, which you can see in the following video. When the clutch lever is pulled, it moves the clutch plates back and forth to engage and disengage the engine from the transmission gears. If the clutch is used when starting to move or when shifting gears. During this rebuild process, I decided to take a little break from the engine and do some work on the carburetor. The carburetor is a very important part of the engine because it controls the flow of air and gasoline that goes into the engine. The carburetor consists of a series of ports, jets, needles, springs, floats, seals, and a few more things not worth mentioning. What I did for my carburetor rebuild was to replace all of the jets and seals. I also replaced the needle valve. The carburetor is where the choke is located. The choke puts more fuel into the engine when it's cold, so it's easier for the engine to start. I then did a deep clean of the carburetor using solvent and compressed air to make sure there's no debris in it. A two-stroke engine is lubricated by the oil mixed into the fuel, and the carburetor jets have tiny, precise passages to control the flow of the fuel flow, and if they're clogged, it can cause the engine to fail due to lack of lubrication. The final stages of my rebuild process is when I could really start to see the final result. This is when I started to work a lot on the dirt bike. I started to realize that this whole project was actually possible, and that really pushed me to finish it. Installing the piston ring, and cylinder was nerve-wracking because they are precision parts and I did not want to scratch or damage them. The finishing touches in the engine were little things like the power valve, which you can see on the right, which is something that uses centrifugal force to open and close a valve to allow more or less exhaust flow depending on the rev of the engine. It also included the water pump, which you can see on the left, which pumps coolant throughout the engine, mainly the cylinder head and the radiator, to help cool it down. Once I had done that, I was ready to put my engine back inside the bike. This is a time lapse of me and my dad putting the engine into the frame of the dirt bike. And this is a pretty big deal because I thought I'd solved the problem and, in theory, was going to have a working dirt bike soon. Once I had the engine in the bike, I realized there was the home stretch. That day, I had worked 8 hours straight to get my bike finished. Most of the work was quite simple, but tedious. But it involved putting back together the frame, connecting all the hoses, and the plastics. I had some trouble putting the exhaust pipe back on, so I had to give it a little bit of a bend. But after that, it fit on fine. I put the carburetor on the engine and got that mounted, along with connecting the rear brake line and clutch cable. Many of the parts were installed with seals or gaskets or adhesive to keep the parts sealed, and this required a gentle touch and care. Installing the vent hoses from the carburetor was challenging because I had to fit them in some tight spaces. Other than that, it all went quite smoothly. Here's a time lapse of me finishing the dirt bike, and my dad is giving me a helping hand just to get it done as soon as we could. I'm sorry about the quality. Finally, on the afternoon the bike was finished, I filled the tank with fuel and got ready to start it. I had all my hopes up and was basically shaking with excitement. I pulled the Kickstarter out and gave it a kick. It sounded great, but didn't start. I tried over and over and over again, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't work. This was disappointing and a little concerning, so I decided to do some troubleshooting. I checked the spark plug by pulling off the wire and giving the engine a kick. It had a spark. So I then removed the spark plug and saw that the bottom of it was dry, with no fuel. This means that no fuel is getting into the engine. Now I knew it was likely a carburetor issue. I then removed the carburetor, and the carburetor bowl was dry, which means no fuel is getting in the carburetor. Now I knew this was likely a flow needle issue. The flow needle is what controls the flow of fuel into the carburetor. I took apart the carburetor, adjusted the flow needle, and put it back together. And I was ready to try to start it for the second time. This is what was going on for about 3 minutes before I finally gave up trying to start it. Once I had the bike supposedly ready to start for the second time, I rolled it outside into the driveway and got ready to start it. After my last attempt at starting it, my hopes were not too high, but I was still excited to try. It started out as my last attempt, which involved kicking and kicking and kicking, but it still did not start. Then it started to sputter a little bit. Not enough to fully start the bike, but enough to tell me it most likely would, and I got super excited. 1 or 2 more kicks, and it worked to life. Success. This next video is a whole lot more exciting than the last one, although as you can see, it was getting late, and the neighbors weren't very happy about the noise. After riding my dirt bike a few times, I started to fall in love with it. It was like a son to me. After spending so many hours working on it, we developed a bond that is indescribable. You may remember that my parents wanted to recoup the money they spent on it and wanted me to sell it after, but the thought of letting it go pained me. So, thanks to my stellar negotiating skills, I managed to convince my parents to let me keep the bike. However, it did not stop there. I further convinced my dad to purchase a dirt bike for himself. My mom wasn't too happy about this, but I hope she'll eventually understand how happy this has made me, my dad. Thanks to these 2 dirt bikes, my dad and I have been having a lot of fun. Going on rides every weekend together has been a blast, and I'm super excited to have been introduced to a new sport, and I now have a whole new appreciation for motorcycle mechanics. I would like to say thank you to all the amazing people who have helped me throughout my Masterworks journey. To my dad, who was always right there to guide me through the rebuilding process and give me help and motivation when I needed it, which was often. I'd also like to say thank you to Jeff, my external advisor, who's always providing insight and lending me his tools when I needed them, giving me inspiration by showing me his dirt bikes and looking over my entire project. One quote that told me was "Knowledge takes away fear," and that really stuck with me throughout my project. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to Jennifer Henriksen, my internal advisor, who's always right there for me on those Wednesday afternoons telling me, "Jake, you need to write." She helped me when I was lost what to do and gave me overall motivation. I'd also like to make an honorable mention to my mom, who very kindly surrendered her garage and kitchen and her garage and dining room table to the workspace that I converted it into. This project would not have been possible without these people, and I cannot thank you guys enough. And thank you to all of you for listening to our presentation today.
Wow, Jake, that was very, very interesting, and congratulations on an excellent presentation that was super informative, and we caught your energy and passion, and I'd love to someday see you and your dad ripping on the hills or something, enjoying those bikes you have. So now it's time, though, where you face the live audience, and we invite the audience to consider questions to Jake, or Mr. Salomi, I should say. So if you would like to ask a question, I invite you to come up here and we'll form a line, looks like behind Malcolm. And again, for those of you that are in our remote audience, you can email me at scott.harrington@islandpacific.org. So let's begin by handing off to... Thank you. Must get to the advisors. Here we go, Jen.
I get first question. Mr. Salomi, so impressed with how you pulled that off. You have to also pitch it. You saw how much information about mechanics was in that presentation. I know nothing about mechanics. I know how to make Jake write his paper, but I don't know anything about mechanics. So in our meetings, it was like Carino and Jake and Jeff were speaking a totally foreign language and completely going off. They had a great time talking about everything. My question, Jake, is percentage-wise, you learn from a lot of people, and you have been learning your whole life from a lot of people. You had an IKEA plan, a huge manual from Yamaha. You had your dad, you had Jeff, you had your grandpa that I'm sure questions. Who did you think you learned the most from? Because it wasn't from me.
Probably my dad, because he was there with the rebuild process more than anybody, and he was the one guiding me through how to work everything. And I think definitely some things we learned together as we went, but more than not, he's one telling me and teaching me how to just do the rebuild.
Awesome. Thank goodness for Carino. This is a question and a comment from your external advisor, Jeff. He says, hello, Mr. Salomi. Great job on your project. It was really fun to watch your progress and to see and hear the final result. I know there were times when you uncovered unforeseen problems that required solutions on the fly, and at times you may have become frustrated with the progress of the project. Now that you have overcome these difficulties and have finished successfully rebuilding the bike, what has your perseverance and commitment taught you? And how will you apply this to projects and tasks in your future?
I think definitely it's taught me that I need to plan out what I'm going to work on before I do it. Because if I don't, my work ethic is horrible and I don't get anything done. And it just ends up sitting, doing nothing for weeks at a time. So I think it's stuff that taught me that I need to plan out what I do before I do it and have a plan on how long I'm going to work for and when I'm going to stop working. So yeah.
A question for me then is, and knowing how much I know about mechanics, how much of a motorbike engine is comparable to, say, a boat engine or, the next machine you want to buy?
All combustion engines are quite similar in that they have a cylinder and a piston, and they take in fuel into that cylinder and is compressed. This bike has only one cylinder and piston. Cars generally have anywhere between 5 to 8, I would say, cylinders and piston to get a lot more power. It compares to most engines and what I would buy, just they're designed differently and have a lot more to them. The dirt bike engine, a two-stroke dirt bike engine is just about as simple as an engine-powered vehicle can get, really.
So what's your next project?
I don't know. I want a jet ski, it'd be pretty cool.
Dodge your cars.
So this motorcycle is a 2003, and a lot of the newer motorcycles have electronic fuel injection and oil injection to improve environmental compliance. But we also saw some full-on electric e-bike dirt bikes, and I'm wondering what you think about whether or not those will be a popular addition to the sport.
I think definitely as our world evolves and people realize that things like dirt bikes may not be very good for the environment, that more people will start turning to electric dirt bikes, full electric dirt bikes, and the full electric dirt bikes right now are really impressive in what they've done and what they've accomplished. Like, they can do just about anything that gas-powered dirt bike can do. And I think that definitely more and more people will start purchasing them, and more dirt bike manufacturers will start putting out a line of electric dirt bikes.
All right, let's go to the audience. Here you go, Malcolm.
Great job, Mr. Salomi. I have a two-question for you. What was your biggest takeaway from motor mechanics?
Probably that, we have so many things in our life that we use, but we really don't understand how they work. After digging into this engine, I understand so much more, and I realized how many things around us use an engine, and I just have a better understanding for it all, yeah.
And my second one is, how long did it take to build your dirt bike?
From around October to March, but that was with on and off working. I'd say on average, I probably worked 5 hours a week. Not even, more? Okay, 10 hours a week. On average, I'd say from about October to March on it.
Mr. Salomi, this is an incredibly impressive presentation. I have a 40-year-old tractor that I tried to work on. I tried to change the hydraulic oil and dumped out all the gear oil. I wish you were with me then. However, your dad stole my question. So I just want to say that I'm incredibly impressed. I have a tiny bit of background experience with people working on engines, and it's an extremely difficult, tedious, and technical job, and I am humbled and impressed by your presentation. Fantastic job.
Thank you.
Fabulous presentation, Mrs. Salomi. My question, I have two actually. How much would this dirt bike, would you like sell it for, or would it be worth? And how much horsepower does it have?
Well, the brand new 2021 versions of this dirt bike, I think, are going for around 8 to 10 grand, brand new. And after this rebuild, these dirt bikes are in pretty high demand and quite popular right now. So I'd probably be able to sell it from anywhere from $3,000 to $3,500 outside. And that's about 120. This dirt bike is 125 cc. And depending on the motor, that can put out a variety of horsepower. But because it's such a high performance engine, it puts around about 35-ish, and that means it has a top speed around like 130 kilometers an hour.
After all the parts you put into it, how much, like what was your final cost to the bike?
Well, I bought the bike for $1,300. And then I think parts, I spent around $1,000 on parts, I would say. So it came out just over $2,000, I think, in total.
Or what was the hardest part that you had to do to rebuild it?
Probably the things that were the most difficult, annoying thing to do were the circlips, because they're these little annoying clips that hold things together instead of like washers, because they take up less space. But they're really, really irritating and make you really annoyed to try to take them off, being done with the proper tool, which I didn't. But probably the most difficult part of the engine was this little shifting mechanism that went from the transmission internal shifting and put it out onto the actual shifting lever. And that had so many tiny little parts and springs and pieces that had to be perfectly placed. And we spent basically all day on this part of the engine that wasn't that big and didn't have so many, like it was just really hard and annoying. I didn't like it.
I'm going to take a question from our students in the think tank. This is from Sam. What was the most fun part personally for you of this entire project?
Probably taking it apart. Like once I had the engine out of the bike, taking the engine apart because I didn't know what I'd got myself into yet. And it was pretty fun just seeing everything unfold and seeing all the cool stuff that's inside of it.
Well then, Mr. Salomi, I was wondering, do you have a favorite trail to ride on? And can you describe the feeling you get when you're on your bike? I have heard that it feels like just like everything else falls away and you're flying.
Favorite trail is probably Wahoo in Squamish. It's pretty exciting. Name speaks for itself. I knew when you're riding it, it's pretty fun. It's pretty speedy, and you just like go along, and it's fun. Yeah, you feel free. So I suggest wearing some well-designed clothing while you ride.
That was a really, really cool painting, Masterworks. I was wondering what size is that dirt bike?
everyone's like just like physical size? I'd say it's about normal. I really don't know. I think it's probably the normal size of a dirt bike. They're all usually around that size. I mean, they can get hit bikes, which are like small miniature dirt bikes, and then they're also like dirt bikes that are bigger. I don't know. That's probably the average size of a dirt bike, I'd say though.
Amazing presentation. What was your, how long did it take to take apart the bike and put it back together? And how long did it take to fix the engine?
Well, the real process involved. So the piece I had to replace was mainly this right here, which is the crankshaft, and piston, which goes like this. And so this part is the last piece in the engine. So you have to take apart every single thing in the engine basically to get to this. To get to that, so I kind of just like took it all apart and replaced the parts I needed to as I put it back together. So I don't know exactly how long it took, but it took about from October to March, averaging around 10 hours a week of work. And I just replaced the parts as I went. So I don't know the math for that, but about that long.
Great job, Mr. Salomi. In the future, do you see yourself working on these bikes for a job?
I think in our evolving society and world, that combustion engines and gas-powered engines are going to become less and less as we turn to electric motors. And so I feel like a career in mechanics may not be very sustainable, or not sustainable, like smart, because there's going to be less and less business as less and less people buy gas-powered engines and just dirt bikes and things like that. So I think you can be consider electronic mechanic, or people that make electronic off-road vehicles. Could be pretty fun.
Very good job, Mr. Salomi. When did you get into dirt biking?
I always wanted to ride one. They made me really excited and I really wanted one, but I never had the chance to get one until October, and I didn't get to ride it for the first time until about March, just like beginning of March probably. It was the first time I rode was the first time I rode a dirt bike, and that was that. And yeah.
Is your dirt bike a gas guzzler or is it pretty fuel efficient?
Mix. Like it's a pretty small engine. Well, it's like smaller than like a brand new car, so it doesn't burn crazy much amount of fuel, but like it also burns quite a bit of fuel. I don't know, but it's in between, I'd say.
What sort of, great job on your presentation, Mr. Salomi. What sort of clothing and kind of like equipment would you wear when you go dirt biking?
The ideal clothing, I think, we'd see, what would make you look superb is body armor, full sleeve jersey, and then for the bottom, we have moto pants with moto boots. I do not have all that. I have the moto pants. That's about it. That's the ideal is what I just described. What I wear is usually a flannel and some pants and boots that I melted on the edge of the side of my dirt bike. Oh, and a helmet, yes, and goggles and gloves. Yep.
You'd be looking good. All right, well, I think at this point we've had all the questions, so I'm going to invite you to meet with your advisors. Jake?
I gotta see if he passes all the.
Oh, I have to start this thing.